It was the kind of Sunday morning in central Georgia that makes the word grace feel like a meteorological event. The air in Cordell still and warm by 8 o'clock, the smell of cut grass and red clay coming through the open doors of First Baptist Church on 12th Avenue. The parking lot full of cars that had been pulling into the same spaces in roughly the same order, for as long as most of the congregation could remember. The Crisp County faithful arrived the way they always arrived in the summer of 1967. The older families first, the younger ones trailing. Children in pressed clothes that would be rumpled by noon. Everybody moving through the familiar choreography of a congregation that had worshiped together long enough to have its own unspoken grammar. Deacon Franklin Marsh was already there when the first families arrived, as he always was. Standing at the side entrance off the parking lot, greeting people by name, asking after their gardens and their grandchildren and their ailing relatives with the specific, practiced warmth of a man who had been performing this particular ministry for 19 years and who was, by every measure available to the people of First Baptist, exactly what he appeared to be. He was 53 years old that summer. He had served as a deacon since 1948. He had never missed a Sunday in 19 years that anyone could recall. His wife, Helen, stood beside him, the way she always stood beside him, slightly to his left. And the two of them together, in the morning light at the side door of First Baptist Church in Cordell, Georgia, looked like a photograph of everything that congregation believed about itself. What nobody standing in that parking lot on that Sunday morning in 1967 knew, what nobody in Cordell knew, or in Crisp County, or in any geography those people inhabited, was that 12 miles away, in a rented room above a dry cleaning shop on 17th Street, a 20-year-old woman named Celia Greer had not come home the night before. Her roommate had waited until midnight, then until 2, then until morning, and had finally called Celia's mother in Americus at 7:45. Celia's mother had called the Cordell City Police at 8. By the time Franklin Marsh was shaking the last hand in that parking lot and following his congregation into the morning service, a patrol officer named Dennis Fugate was parked on 17th Street trying to understand why a young woman who worked at the dry cleaner below her own room had simply stopped being present in the world. She had been missing for 14 hours. She would be missing for 57 years. And the man who knew exactly what had happened to her greeted her absence every Sunday for 5.5 decades from the side door of a church, in the company of people who would have staked their lives on his character. But to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Celia Greer was. Cordell, Georgia called itself the watermelon capital of the world, a designation it earned with agricultural sincerity and wore with civic pride. And in the summer of 1967, it was a town of 11,000 people built around the intersection of 2 rail lines and the kind of economic life that grows in places where the soil is good and the distance to anywhere large is significant enough to make self-sufficiency a virtue. The downtown had a department store, 2 pharmacies, a hardware emporium on the corner of 7th that had been there since the 1920s. And the kind of diner culture that keeps a town's social metabolism running, the Peach Street Cafe, where the breakfast crowd stayed until 10 and where the coffee was bottomless and the conversations were not. Celia Greer had arrived in Cordell from Americus, 30 miles west, in January of 1967, following a job listing at the dry cleaning shop on 17th that paid better than anything available in Americus, and that came with the room above as part of the arrangement. She was 20 years old and the oldest of 4 children, and she had been helping support her family since she was 15. Her father had been incapacitated by a back injury in 1962, and her mother, Loretta, had worked the school cafeteria and done alterations from home, and raised 4 children on the margin, between making it and not making it. And Celia had understood, from the time she was old enough to understand anything, that her contribution to that margin mattered. She was not unhappy in Cordell, Her roommate, a young woman named Patsy Dill, who worked at the telephone exchange, described her as someone who took pleasure in small things. A good meal, a letter from home, a Friday evening at the Picture House on 9th Street, the watermelon stands that appeared along the roads in late summer. She sent money home every 2 weeks, a portion of her pay in a sealed envelope to her mother, without fail. She had a photograph of her 3 younger siblings on the table beside her bed and a postcard of the Georgia coast pinned above her desk. She had never been to the coast, but she intended to go. She was saving for it. She was also, since March of 1967, a new member of the choir at First Baptist Church on 12th Avenue. She had been brought by Patsy, who had been a member for 3 years, and she had stayed because the choir director told her she had a voice worth developing and because the congregation had welcomed her with a warmth that felt genuine, which it largely was. She had met Franklin Marsh at the side door on her 3rd Sunday. He had asked her name and where she was from and whether she was settling in all right, and she had told him yes. She thought she was. She had been a member of the choir for 4 months when she disappeared. On the evening of Saturday, July 22nd, 1967, Celia Greer left the rented room on 17th Street at approximately 6:15, telling Patsy Dill she was going to meet someone briefly and would be back by 9. She did not say who. She was wearing a yellow dress and carrying a small white purse. Patsy watched her go down the outside stairs to the alley. That was the last time anyone who admitted to seeing her would say they had seen her. She did not come back by 9. She did not come back at all. Officer Dennis Fugate of the Cordell Police Department was 26 years old and 2 years on the force, and he handled the initial missing persons report on the morning of July 23rd. With the thoroughness of a young officer who had not yet learned which cases his department was inclined to pursue with urgency and which it was not. He interviewed Patsy Dill, documented the yellow dress and the white purse and the 6:15 departure, and the unspecified errand and the name of the person Celia was meeting, which Patsy did not know. He drove to Americus and interviewed Loretta Greer in her kitchen and noted, carefully, that Loretta was certain her daughter had not left voluntarily. Celia called home every Sunday without exception, and the Sunday call had not come. By Tuesday, July 25th, the investigation had been assigned to Detective Sergeant Alton Briggs, who was 44 years old and who had been the department's senior investigator for 6 years. Briggs was competent in the specific way of investigators who operate inside limited institutional resources. He knew what he had, he worked what he had, and he was honest with himself about the gap between those 2 things. He canvassed the 2-block radius around the 17th Street property. He spoke to every business owner on the street. He identified 2 witnesses who had seen a young woman in a yellow dress on 17th Street on the evening of July 22nd, both placing her near the corner of 17th and Oak around 6:30. He also asked, as part of a broader canvass of people Celia was known to have contact with through First Baptist, to speak with each member of the choir leadership and the Deacon board. He interviewed Franklin Marsh on July 28th. Marsh expressed appropriate concern and offered that Celia had seemed like a fine young woman and a welcome addition to the choir. He confirmed he had no knowledge of her whereabouts. He was not asked about his own movements on the evening of July 22nd, because he had not, at that point, emerged as anything other than a community figure being canvassed as part of a general inquiry. His name was in the file. It was not circled. The institutional failure arrived in 2 parts. The first, a witness, an elderly man named Horace Spivey, who operated a shoe repair shop on the corner of 17th and Oak, told a neighbor in a private conversation that reached Briggs secondhand 3 weeks after the investigation began, that he had seen a young woman matching Celia's description get into a car on the evening of July 22nd near his shop. He had been reluctant to come forward directly. Briggs went to see him. Spivey confirmed what he had said. He described the car as a dark sedan. He was less certain about the driver. He said it was a man he thought he recognized, but could not say for certain. He did not give a name. Briggs pressed him. Spivey said he wasn't sure enough to say. He was 71 years old. Briggs noted the conversation and filed it. He went back to Spivey twice over the following month. Both times, Spivey said he still wasn't sure enough to say. The second failure. Celia Greer was a young black woman from a working-class family in Americas with no local connections of influence. And in Cordele, Georgia in 1967, the investigative energy allocated to her disappearance was proportionate to that reality in a way that is important to name directly. And that Alton Briggs, in a letter he wrote in 1991 to the Crisp County Sheriff's Office requesting a cold case review, named himself. The case had not received the resources it deserved, and he had known it at the time, and he had not done enough about it. And he was writing because he was 68 years old and intended to say so clearly before he no longer could. The cold case review was acknowledged. It was not assigned. Meanwhile, Loretta Greer received the Sunday phone call that never came and kept receiving its absence every week for the rest of her life. By 1977, 10 years had passed. Patsy Dill had moved to Macon and married and had 2 children and kept Celia's photograph in the front room of her house because she had promised herself she would. By 1987, 20 years had passed. Alton Briggs had retired. Horace Spivey was dead. Dennis Fugate, who had never fully set the case aside in the private accounting of his career, had risen to captain and had twice attempted to reopen the investigation through formal department channels and had twice been told the file would be reviewed when bandwidth permitted. By 1997, 30 years had passed, and Franklin Marsh, 73 years old, had been a deacon of First Baptist Church in Cordele for 49 years. He had outlived 2 pastors. He had presided at deacon meetings and sat on building committees and organized the annual Thanksgiving food drive and been present at the bedsides of dying congregation members, offering the comfort that the dying and their families had come to expect from him. The congregation of First Baptist understood themselves to be in the presence, every Sunday, of a man whose faith was structural rather than decorative, someone who had built a life around his commitments and whose commitments had held. Helen Marsh died in 2003. Their children, a son in Savannah, a daughter in Augusta, came home for the funeral and for the weeks after and eventually returned to their lives, leaving Franklin Marsh alone in the house on Pecan Street, where he had lived for 40 years. He was 89 years old by 2024. He was still attending First Baptist on Sundays, brought by his son on the Sundays the son was in town, otherwise by a neighbor who had been driving him since he stopped driving himself in 2019. He was still known at First Baptist as a man of character. He was still greeted by the people who had known him for decades and the younger members who knew him by reputation, as someone whose long tenure was itself a kind of testimony. Loretta Greer had died in 2014 without an answer. Celia's youngest sibling, a brother named Raymond, who was 9 years old when Celia disappeared and who was now 66, had been calling the Cordele Police Department's cold case line twice a year since 2001. He had received 4 return calls in 23 years. Then, in the spring of 2024, a genealogy researcher working a contract assignment for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's newly funded Cold Case DNA initiative uploaded a reference sample to the NamUs registry for a set of unidentified remains recovered from a creek drainage site in Crisp County in 1989. Remains that had been cataloged as unidentified and had remained so for 35 years. The GBI's process works by submitting biological material from unidentified remains to a national DNA database and cross-referencing against family reference samples submitted by relatives of the missing. An increasingly powerful tool as the pool of reference samples grows. Raymond Greer had submitted his own DNA sample to NamUs in 2009 during an enrollment drive he had learned about from a victim's family support network in Atlanta. He had heard nothing back for 15 years. The match came back in April of 2024. The GBI investigator assigned, Special Agent Dana Holloway, was sitting at her desk in Atlanta when the system flagged it. She read the match data. She pulled the Crisp County remains file from 1989. She pulled the original Cordell missing persons file on Celia Greer from 1967. She read Alton Briggs's 1991 letter to the Crisp County Sheriff, requesting the cold case review that had never been assigned. And then she looked at the name of the man Briggs had written about, the man he had noted in that 1991 letter as someone he had always felt was carrying something he never asked the right question to surface. Franklin Marsh, Deacon, First Baptist Church, Cordell, still living. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research. Locating records, reading the letters that were never answered, tracing the lives behind the file numbers. If that work matters to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's get back to what Dana Holloway found. Holloway drove to Cordell on a Wednesday morning in May of 2024 with a Crisp County Sheriff's detective named Sergeant Vince Okafor, who had been briefed on the case the previous evening and who was, by his own account in a later press statement, not prepared for the name on the file, despite having been told in advance what it was. Some names in a community carry a weight that preparation cannot fully address. The investigation that Holloway and Okafor built over the following 6 weeks was meticulous by necessity. They were working against the calendar of a man who was 90 years old and in declining health, and against the calendar of a legal system that required more than a DNA match to bring a charge. The DNA established with conclusive certainty that the 1989 Crisp County remains were Celia Greer's. It established where she had been and when she had been there, in the geological and biological sense. What it did not, by itself, establish was the chain of human events that had placed her in that creek drainage site. That chain was built from 3 sources. The first was Alton Briggs's original case notes, which contained, buried in the supplemental interview file, never entered into the formal case summary, a second, undated conversation with Horace Spivey in which Spivey had gone further than he had in the documented interviews. He had not given a name, but he had described the car as a dark green Buick LeSabre. He had described the driver as someone he had seen at First Baptist on multiple occasions. He had described the man as wearing a white shirt. Franklin Marsh, records confirmed, drove a 1966 Buick LeSabre, dark green, registered in his name. The registration was in the original 1967 file. It had never been cross-referenced against Spivey's car description because Spivey's undated supplemental notes had been filed in the wrong folder, behind the Canvas survey forms rather than with the witness interview summaries, and had not been read by any investigator in 57 years until Dana Holloway found them on a Tuesday afternoon in a physical archive box in the Cordell Police Department's storage facility. The second source was Franklin Marsh's son, David, who had driven down from Savannah when investigators contacted him to discuss his father's health and legal situation. David Marsh sat with Holloway for 2 hours and said, carefully and with visible anguish, that there had been a conversation between himself and his father in 2019, during the period when his father was adjusting medication and had experienced several nights of significant agitation and distress, in which his father had said things that David had not known how to process and had not fully processed until he was sitting in this room, now being told what the DNA had found. He did not repeat the specifics of what his father had said. He confirmed that the conversation had existed. He confirmed that what his father had described had involved a young woman and a summer evening, and something that had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone. He confirmed that he had told no one because he had not wanted to believe what he had heard, and then had found it easier, year by year, not to. He wept once during the 2 hours, briefly, and then continued. The third source was Franklin Marsh himself. He was interviewed on June 11, 2024, at his home on Pecan Street, with Holloway, Okafor, and a representative from the district attorney's office present. He was seated in his kitchen. He was 90 years old. He had been told, before the interview, that the remains had been identified and what the identification meant. He sat with that information for a long moment. Then he said, "I was afraid of what people would think of me." He said it the way people say things that they have been holding for so long, the words have lost their shape. Not as an explanation, not as an excuse, as a fact about the person he had been at 53 years old, on an evening in July 1967, when fear of consequences had done the work that conscience had failed to do. He gave a full statement. He confirmed what the evidence had assembled. He described the evening of July 22nd in the specific, unhurried way of a man who has rehearsed something in his own mind for 57 years and for whom the telling is not difficult because the remembering never stopped. He described the drive to the site in Crisp County in the dark, in a car he had sold the following spring. He described going back to the church on Sunday and greeting the families at the side door because he did not know what else to do, and because the doing of ordinary things had always been his refuge. He described 57 Sundays of side doors and handshakes, and by name, and how is your grandmother, and the Thanksgiving food drive, and the bedsides of the dying. He described Helen, who had never known. He described his children, who would now know everything. He was charged with first-degree murder in July of 2024. Given his age and medical condition, the court appointed a guardian ad litem to assess his competency for trial. In September of 2024, with competency confirmed and trial preparation underway, Franklin Marsh died in his home on Pecan Street. He was 90 years old. He had outlived Celia Greer by 57 years and 3 months. There would be no trial, no verdict, no sentence. What there was, what the law had finally produced after 57 years, was a name attached permanently to what had been done. A record that said clearly and without qualification what had happened to Celia Greer and who had made it happen. That record exists. It will not be revised. The congregation of First Baptist Church in Cordell had a Sunday, 2 weeks after the arrest, in which the pastor addressed what the community was carrying. He did not tell them what to feel. He said that the truth, however late and however painful, was still the truth, and that their responsibility to it had not changed because the man they had trusted had not been who they believed him to be. He said that Celia Greer had been a member of their choir and that her family had been waiting for 57 years, and that the congregation owed it to her memory to hold what they now knew clearly and not to look away from it. Several people left the service early. Most stayed. The choir sang without a director that morning, from memory, which was how they had always sung best. Celia Greer was 20 years old. She sent money home every 2 weeks in a sealed envelope, and she had a photograph of her 3 younger siblings on the table beside her bed and a postcard of the Georgia coast she had never visited pinned above her desk because she intended to go and she was saving for it. She had a voice worth developing, and a yellow dress and a white purse and an errand on a Saturday evening in July, and a family in Americus waiting for a Sunday phone call that never came. Raymond Greer was 67 years old when the GBI called him in the spring of 2024 to tell him what the DNA match had found. He had been calling the Cordell cold case line twice a year for 23 years. He had submitted his DNA sample in 2009 and waited 15 years for a result. He had outlived his mother, who had died without an answer, and he had made a choice, sometime in the long middle of the waiting, to keep calling rather than to stop, because stopping felt like a second loss he was not willing to accept. He attended the press conference in Cordell when the case was announced. He was asked afterward how he felt. He said that he wanted people to understand that his sister was not a cold case. She was a person. She liked watermelon season and the Picture House on 9th Street. And she was saving money to see the Georgia coast, and she sang in the choir of a church where the man who killed her shook her hand at the side door every Sunday before she disappeared. He said, "She deserved better than what happened to her. And she deserved better than 57 years of nothing. But she has her name back now. That's something." What does it say about the architecture of trust in a small community that a man can commit a terrible act and then spend half a century rebuilding himself inside the very institution connected to his victim? Not fleeing, not hiding, but staying, returning every Sunday, performing the rituals of faith and fellowship as if they could absorb what he had done? What do we owe to the investigators like Alton Briggs, who wrote a letter in 1991 naming what he had failed to pursue and asking for a review that was never assigned? Because they understood that honesty about institutional failure is its own form of accountability? And what does Raymond Greer's 23 years of twice-yearly phone calls say about the kind of faith that does not require a reasonable expectation of return?